Welcome to the Arthur Russ Gallery. I'm Lynn Marsden Atlas, Executive Director, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you back in 2022 to this groundbreaking exhibition, No Ocean Between Us, Art of Asian Diasporas in Latin America and the Caribbean from 1945 to the present. An exhibition that explores Asian migration to Latin America and the Caribbean and its influence on modern and contemporary art. Inspired by the permanent collection of the AMA, the Art Museum of the Americas of the Organization of American States, No Ocean Between Us features more than 30 important works by Latin American and Caribbean artists of Asian heritage. The exhibition demonstrates how this work emerged from cross-directional global dialogues between the artists, their Asian cultural heritages, their Latin American or Caribbean identities, and their interaction with major artistic movements. The opening this evening, is co-sponsored by Asian American Studies, the Center for Latin American and Latinx Studies, and the Arthur Russ Gallery. And special thanks to Freya Khan, Kathy Barch, and Talia Faletti for making this possible. Please join us for our many hybrid programs over the next 3 months that include performances by Pan Yo and the Pan Asian Dance Troupe, a fascinating panel discussion with Penn scholars Fernando Chang Moy and Rupa Pillai, and a lecture by Evelyn Hugh DeHart on migration and the empires of Latin America and the Caribbean. And please join us next Wednesday on February 12th for a 12-minute talk that will be given by Kathy Barch on a topic of her choice on the exhibition. As always, the Arthur Russ Gallery is free and open to the public. It's my great pleasure this evening to introduce Adriana Ospina, curator of this traveling exhibition that she developed, curated and organized in collaboration with international arts and artists. Adriana Ospina is the director of the Art Museum of the Americas of the Organization of American States. Since 2007, she has held the position of educational program manager, and since 2014, curator of the permanent collection. She has curated numerous exhibitions. Among them are Fusion, Tracing Asian Migration to the Americas, Femininity Beyond Archetypes, photographs by Natalia Arias, A Gaze Through the CINTAS Fellowship Program, a selection of works from the CINTAS Foundation, Arts of the Americas and No Ocean Between Us, Art of Asian Diasporas in Latin America and the Caribbean, 1945 to the present. And this is the 4th iteration of this exhibition. It has traveled to the Kalamazoo Museum in Michigan, to San Antonio in Texas, and it was in Washington, D.C. when I saw it at the museum. And we're happy and we're thrilled to have it here at Penn today. Adriana has also co-curated exhibitions including Visual Memory, Home and Place, and Dialog, Landscape and Abstraction. Frida Grand, an AMA permanent collection, and she has also edited the book Collection of the Art Museum of the Americas of the Organization of American States in 2017, and she's participated in the College Art Association Conference in 2013 and 2020. She holds an MA in art history from George Mason University, and she is intrepid. She's come through the snow tonight to give us the lecture in person. So please help me welcome Adriana.
Thank you very much. It is such a pleasure to be here today. And actually, right after we finish, I have to hop on the train and go back to my kids. We're gonna make the talk today dynamic. So we're gonna actually walk around the gallery and see the different pieces, and our viewers at home will will accompany us in the tour. So I would like to thank the Arthur Ross Gallery and its team for putting this exhibition together, especially Director Lynn Marsden Atlas, Gallery Coordinator Susan L. Seisman, Assistant Director of Development Sarah Stewart, and Alice Zhao, the intern. No Ocean Between Us, Art of the Asian Diasporas in Latin America and the Caribbean, 1945 to the present. I would like to begin this presentation tonight with this quote by Patricia Mohammed. Rather than seeing the region, Latin America and the Caribbean, as a collection of civilizations that were forced into submission to each other, I imagine the space as a rebirth of new living cultures, regenerated by the synthesis and hybridity. And that's precisely what No Ocean Between Us is about. A presentation of art that reveals the complex artistic richness of the Asian diaspora in the region, replete with synthesis and hybridity, that Mohammed mentions, as well as histories of diasporas that are not yet widely known. This exhibition frames artwork as active historical documents, revealing the multiple layers of complex and evolving cultural exchanges that had shaped modern multi-ethnic societies of today. The rich, multi-layered cultural fabric of Latin America and Caribbean cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the remarkable diversity of cultural threads woven by migratory influence from East, South, and Southeast Asia. No Ocean offers a fascinating glimpse of modern and contemporary art through an exploration of migration flows from Japan, China, India, and Indonesia, as well as their significant artistic impact in their host countries, which include Argentina, Brazil, Cuba, Guyana, Jamaica, Panama, Peru, Mexico, Trinidad and Tobago, and Suriname. Although the initial Asian migration to Latin America and the Caribbean dates from the 16th century, it was not until the mid-18th century that it began on a large scale, floating in multiple countries to fill the labor shortages caused by the abolition of slavery in the Caribbean colonies in the 1830s. The new Latin American republics, Brazil, Panama, Peru, Argentina, and Mexico, along with the Spanish, English, and Dutch empires, began to import Asian indentured servitude, in most cases, as a low-wage workforce for agriculture. After internship ended, the majority of ways that took place afterwards, creating new ways of arrival of new populations until today. The aim of this exhibition is to showcase the role of the Visual Arts Department of the Organization of the American States, predecessor of the Art Museum of the Americas, in recognizing the contributions of the Asian diaspora to Latin America and the Caribbean in the early 1961. With the groundbreaking exhibition, Japanese Artists of the Americas, by periodically showing the seminal work of Japanese, Peruvian, Mexican, and Argentine artists, as well as actively collecting them. The OAS has established an evolving canon of modern Latin American art. Similarly, with the 1972 exhibition, Contemporary Art from the Caribbean, Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad, and Tobago, the OAS addressed the centrality of Indian and Chinese traditions within the crucible of elements that shape Caribbean culture and society. Today, I would like to highlight some of the sections of the exhibition. So I would like to start with the Japanese section. So let's imagine for a minute the map that we just saw at the entrance of the gallery. And we're gonna travel through that map, connecting Asia and Latin America. So let's talk about Brazil. In 1908, the transatlantic ship Catsato Maru anchored in Port of Santos in the Brazilian state of Sao Paulo, bearing the very first contingency of Japanese migrants contracted for work on Brazil's coffee plantation. The Japanese migration to Brazil can be divided into 3 stages. The intensive influx period from 1908 to 1924, the restriction period for 1942 to 1953, in which immigration was restricted due to Japan's role in World War II, and the post-war period, 1952 and 1960s, during which Brazil authorized more than 9,000 Japanese families to work on agricultural development. Today, the legacy of the vast Japanese Brazilian community has strongly permeated the cultural landscape of Sao Paulo. A cultural boom of the migration was the creation of the Sevilla Kai group of artists of Sao Paulo, a powerful coalition of Japanese Brazilian artists that by 1965 had already 300 subscribers, ranging from sculptures to paintings. Now I'm going to invite all of you to follow me here. And we're going to talk about this piece by Manabu Mabe, titled Agony. And it's a central piece in the collection of the Art Museum of the Americas. Manabu Mabe was born in Japan and immigrated to Brazil with his family in 1934 at the age of 10. Much of his youth was spent working on a coffee plantation, where, to his father's disapproval, he spent much of his free time sketching and painting. In 1947, Mabe and other artists established the collective Sebe Akai group, which not only helped to shape his career, but also enabled his support to other Japanese artists in Brazil. Mabe began to receive recognition for his work in the early 1950s, and in 1957, sold his farm and moved to Sao Paulo, finally dedicating his life fully to art. Although his early work in the 1950s depicts figurative subjects, such as landscapes, he also experimented with geometry as a way to minimize the role of figure on the canvas, perhaps as a response of the emerging Brazilian neo-concrete art movement. Mabe's mature style is characterized by bursts of color and line upon color-blocked monochromatic backgrounds. His unique approach to informalism incorporates the graceful lines of his study of Japanese calligraphy. Some art scholars refer to this kind of abstraction as calligraphic abstraction, echoing the evocative strokes of Zen Buddhist painting. Now, let's walk here, and we're gonna talk about this, which is actually my favorite piece, and I was really pleased to see it at the entrance of the gallery. It was like to talk to Kazuo Kawayashi when I started the research on this exhibition, and I learned by Christmas that he passed away just like at the end of last year. So I had the opportunity to visit Wakabayashi's home and studio and chat with him about his work and how Manabu Mabe was a central figure in uniting the Japanese Brazilian artists. Their homes are actually side by side. Born in Kobe, Japan in 1931, Kazuo Kawayashi was already a trained artist when he immigrated to Sao Paulo in 1961. There, he became an influential member of the Japanese Brazilian artistic community, joining the Sebe Akai group. His work from the 1960s and the 1970s can be categorized as informalist, while also adhering to geometric principles, and it's marked by thick textured surface and abstract monochromatic forms. Regarding this first period, he explained that his goal was to sail artistically from his Japanese tradition and look for what he calls the real Brazilian heart. Now we're gonna, this is the map that I was mentioning. Now we're gonna move to and imagine that we are traveling right now to Brazil, sorry. So let's gather in between this video and the piece the sculpture over here. After Brazil, Peru is the host of the second largest Japanese population in South America, with approximately 80,000 inhabitants of Japanese descent. The Japanese legacy in Peru goes back to the late 19th century, when the shortage of indigenous labor led to Peruvian planters to reach to Asian countries for migrant workers. In 1989, the first Japanese immigrants arrived in a group of 700 to work on Peru's cotton and sugar plantations. Carlos Tanaka, that is the artist that we see right now with this sculpture and this video that you're gonna see in a minute, is restarting. Is an artist of Japanese, English, and Peruvian descent. His maternal grandfather, Guillermo Tanaka, emigrated from Japan in the 1920s, but died young, never meeting his grandson. Tanaka's grandmother, however, sought to preserve her late husband's heritage, but instilling in her family a reverence for Japanese culture. In 1994, Tanaka began a series of installations based on the concepts of memory, journey, and displacement, using the crafts, construction for origami, ceramic, and glass as metaphor of the Japanese migrant experience. Tanaka linked his sculptural work to the legacy of the Japanese grandfather he never knew. The idea of using the crab as a migratory symbol came to him after seeing at the Cerro Azul beach in Peru a monument of the Japanese immigrants that was surrounded by crabs. Now let's continue over here. Calligraphy. Lam's aunt, with whom he was very close, was a santera of Afro-Cuban religion. Nevertheless, his mother, who had Spanish as well as African roots, chose to raise him in the Roman Catholic and European cultural traditions. Lam's artistic talent soon won him international acclaim. However, due to the US restrictions on Chinese migration, he was not able to visit New York until 1947 and 1946, even though his work had been shown there continually since early 1940s and was a part of the MoMA collection, for example. Having worked with Cubists and Surrealists while living in Spain and France during the 1920s and 1930s, Lam employed a synthesis of Surrealism and Cubism in his art, with major influence from Picasso, Cézanne, and Matisse, while also integrating his Afro-Cuban heritage, particularly his interest in African primitivism and sculptural traditions of New Guinea. As a major Latin American artist who also played a vital role in the Parisian avant-garde, Lam has been widely studied and debated. For instance, some scholars contended that there was not formal evidence of his Chinese heritage in his work. Roberto Cobas, curator of Havana's Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes, has argued that there is a trace of the Chinese cultural in Lam's work. It shows itself only in its discipline, with which he devoted himself to work on paper. That's why this exhibition only has works on paper by Wilfredo Lam. Drawing, etching, aquatints, lithographs during the 1960s and throughout the 1980s. Speaking generally, Cobas explained, beyond the simultaneity of his creations, whether they are close to figuration or abstraction, or the approach into his themes, new or current, Lam imposes a singular plastic resource. This is due to the alignment of the elements coming from cultures such as Afro-Caribbean, European, Asiatic, and the Pacific Islands. Now in our trip, we are still talking about China let's move to this section over here, and we're gonna talk about Panama. The first significant wave of migration from China arrived in Panama in the 1850s, attracted by the California gold rush. This influx brought new life to dormant projects of linking the Panama and the United States by the Interoceanic Railroad, whose completion was largely dependent on the labor of Chinese immigrants. Panama was soon a bustling transit point between China and such destinations as the United States, Cuba, and Peru. Amidst tensions, the Chinese community built a prosperous Chinatown district that in the 1970s reached its cultural and economic zenith. Today, Panama has a new Chinatown, and the influx of immigrants from China continues to be steady today. And right now, we're gonna highlight this piece by Samuel Rumaldo Choi. Rumaldo Choi was born in 1990 in Panama City to a Chinese Panamanian family. His grandfather arrived at the port of Colón in Panama from Guangdong Canton in the 1930s, eventually supporting himself as a cook, a vocation that has left a deep impression in the Choi family, whose family events still revolve around the Chinese dining traditions. These customs also appear as a vivid motif of Rumaldo Choi's artwork. Raised in an extended family of a multi-ethnic artist, Rumaldo Choi took the curatorial lead in creating the group #Panachina Project, inviting his cousins to be all part of that exhibition. In addition to some young other artists to continue to the work evocative to their experience as members of the Panachina community in Panama. So other artists, part of that group is Laura from Fong Prosper, who did this video. Rumaldo Choi has developed innovative work rooted in traditions of Chinese food in Panama, exploring how this foreign cuisine and customs have syncretized with local tradition. A local maxim is that there is nothing more Panamanian than a Chinese breakfast. In Pancho, the piece that we see right now, the artist presents a typical Chinese lazy Susan that proffers both Chinese and Panamanian food, creating his own version of a multi-ethnic Chino-Panamanian meal. And now if we turn, you can stay right here and turn to this piece that we have in the background. So now let's talk about India. And right now we're gonna highlight Trinidad. With the waning of Chinese migration, British authorities next looked to East India as a source of indentured labor to Trinidad's plantation. Most of the recruits came from Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. On May 30th, 1845, the transatlantic boat Fad al-Razak arrived at Trinidad with 225 indentured workers, the first ripple of what will be a massive wave of Indian migration. By 1917, the indentured system was abolished, and the flow of East Indian laborers to the island nation came to an end. The assimilation of Indian culture in Trinidad was relatively slow, a slow, complex, syncretic process. Due to its more gender-balanced demographics, labor recruiters in India often ship entire families whose languages, castes, and religion, primarily Hinduism and Islam, were important familial bonds. And right now we're gonna highlight the work of MP Aladdin. Born in Takirawa, Trinidad and Tobago, Mohammed Farouk Aladdin, known as MP Aladdin, was one of the first visual artists to emerge from the country's large Indian population. He was most influential, however, as an art educator. He learned his teaching certificate in Trinidad after the British Council awarded him a scholarship to the Birmingham College of Arts and Crafts. And in the United States, he earned his master's degree from Columbia University. Aladdin founded Trinidad's Art Teachers Association and also served as the director of cultural and the Ministry of Education and Culture for many years. In his own words, education through art should be given the greatest attention if more complete individuals are to be produced by educational institutions. Aladdin was a gifted author who produced some notable research papers on Trinidad's local culture. His written works are still widely used as a reference material on Trinidad's traditions. As a fine artist, Aladdin won the renown throughout the Caribbean, Latin America, and the United States and Europe, exhibited in group shows at the Organization of the American States, for example. Most importantly, he was an advocate for the inclusion of both Trinidadian and Indian themes in the work of local artists at a time when most painters were trained in favor of Western or European traditional subject matters. Stylistically, Aladdin's works treat Trinidadian and Indian subjects with modernist approach. Aladdin's works range from rural scenes depicting the daily life of Trinidadian farmers in the 1950s or urban landscapes of the island, from Hindu festivities such as the New Year celebration known as Pawa, a favorite subject of Aladdin's, which reveals the importance of Indian heritage to his overview. More experimental scenes such as this acrylic of canvas titled The Palms from 1973. This work integrates figurative motifs of the island through the use of a palette inspired by its geography, juxtaposing black and red-toned palm fronds from a background that uses the same technique, layering fronds and shading of blue, yellow, and purple. In this way, Aladdin combines an organic pattern with a geometric one, creating a grid. Aladdin's work in the 1970s focused extensively on the explorations of these contrasting patterns. This piece was shown for the very first time at the Organization of American States in 1973 in the exhibition Tribute to Picasso, and was acquired for the organization's permanent collection in 1976. Okay. Now let's go to where we started. We're gonna talk about Guyana and this magnificent piece that we have here. So the Asian migration to Guyana resembles in many aspects the contemporaneous Asian migrations to Suriname and Trinidad and Tobago. The first two migrant vessels to arrive from Calcutta, the Willoughby and the Hesperus, docked in Guyana on May 3, 1838, with more than 300 men, 11 women, and 17 children. Despite the racial and cultural discrimination under which they were forced to live during their servitude, Guyana's Indian migrants, predominantly Hindus, with a small minority of Muslims, were generally allowed to maintain their traditions and religions. By 1917, when indentureship was finally eliminated, Indians had settled in Guyana, making them the largest ethnic group in the inland Caribbean country. So this piece that we see right now, titled El Dorado After All, is by Suchitra Matai. Matai's family has its roots in the wave of Indian immigrants who arrived in Guyana over a century ago to work as indentured servants. And immigrating herself, Matai left Guyana when she was 3 years old and has since lived in Canada, India, and the United States. While pursuing her PhD in South Asian art, she opted to become a full-time artist. Matai is a multimedia artist who works with painting, collage, installation, video, and sculpture. Her materials range from found painting clippings, and National Geographic magazines to needlepoint and embroidery. Matai's highly conceptual pieces deal with issues of identity and the role of women in the arts while challenging suppressive narratives such as those associated with colonialism. In El Dorado, after all, a work of woven mixed media based on a found photo of the possible location of El Dorado, the legendary kingdom of gold sought by conquistadors, Matai explores the idea of home and colonization while referencing the weaving practices of her mother and grandmothers, which she uses as a metaphor for interlacing of cultures. And now we're gonna just turn around to that dragon piece over there. And we are gonna talk about the migration from Indonesia to Suriname. The indentured workers who came to the inland Caribbean country to work on its sugar, coffee, and cotton plantation originated from 3 distinct Asian countries: China, India, and Indonesia. So we're gonna highlight today the Indonesian migration. The first major Japanese migration of workers to Suriname began in 1890s through the Dutch company Soesmans Immigrate Kantor. Despite the Dutch colonization of Java, migrant labor in Suriname had generally come from East India through British companies as the importing of Japanese labor was more costly. Nevertheless, Japanese migration was part of the new political effort by the Dutch to become less dependent on the British colonial government in India. A second wave of migration from Java took place in the 1930s through the end of World War II. This initiative encouraged entire families to settle in Suriname to help populate the country. So we're gonna highlight today the work of Soeki Irodikromo. This is also a piece part of the collection of the Art Museum of the Americas. Soeki Irodikromo was born to Japanese parents in Suriname, a former Dutch colony that did not gain independence until 1975. Like many other artists from the Dutch-speaking nation, Irodikromo journeyed to the Netherlands in the 1960s to undertake formal art training in Rotterdam, where his intense study of the Cobra movement left a lasting impression on his work. In the late 1970s, he received a scholarship to travel to Indonesia, where he learned batik, a traditional Indonesian technique of wax resist dyeing. Upon his return to Suriname, Irodikromo helped reintroduce this art form to the country. Irodikromo considers Suriname to be a genuine melting pot of cultures, and this hybridity and cultural diversity can be seen in his work. His paintings, batik, ceramics, and drawings reveal a host of influences, from Indonesian mythology and indigenous motifs to the rich colors of Surinamese jungle and the avant-garde techniques of the Cobra movement, which combine strong colors with a rebelliousness and spontaneity inspired by the artistic process of small children who approach their work without a preconceived plan. In his work, Irodikromo marshals elements of Eastern and Western culture that richly evoke the cultural divides and fusion of his native Suriname, where indigenous populations coexist and mixed with descendants of both the former Dutch colonies and the contractor workers imported from Dutch, India, from the Dutch, from India, China, and Indonesia. This piece, an oil painting on canvas of rich in color and texture, is inspired by the figure of Ravana, a multi-headed demon from the Hindu epic Ramayana. The painting was first associated with Barong, a character from the Balinese mythology, until sources close to the artist identified it as Ravana. In this painting, Irodichromo presents only a head, which he describes as a moment of explosion, horror, and exuberance. In Japanese culture, different versions of Ravana can be seen in wood carved decorations, which usually take the form of high relief carvings of the head of a dragon, crowned by a lion's mane and decorated with flowers and arabesque motifs. Here, Irodichromo has transformed the image of the dragon into the fabric by means of thick brushstrokes that recreates the texture and patterns of the wood carving. Using saturated, vibrant colors, he projects the richness and fullness of the image of Ravana. In so doing, he creates his own version of the dragon, as well as a highly decorative piece of typical of Indonesian art. This work was given to the permanent collection of the Art Museum of the Americas by the Surinamese government. And it's really important because while working with him and interviewing him, he passed away while we were working in the exhibition. And he was so proud that finally a piece of him had made it to a show about inclusion and the migration on the different threads of Asian migration to Latin America and the Caribbean. So if you have any questions, let me know. Yeah.
Are there any plans for this exhibition to potentially travel to Japan, China, or Indonesia, or Korea?
Well, not right now. It will be ideally, but it is really expensive. But we are not close to that possibility. But it will be fantastic. Yeah.
Did you have difficulty in deciding which artists to represent?
It was very difficult. So this exhibition is a 6 years. It's a 6-year process of selecting the artworks, the narrative. We had to leave many artists out and many pieces. So from our collection in particular, to give you just an example, this piece over here, the wooden boxes, this artist, his name is Eduardo Tokeshi, he's from Peru, and we have 2 beautiful pieces in our collection by him. But when I went to his studio and saw the 2 altar pieces juxtaposing his background, like that's his biography right there. So I had to make the decision to go for this piece instead of the piece that we had in our collection. In some of the cases, I did. For the alive artists, when I had the opportunity to interact with them and select the pieces. So the piece that you have right behind you. So with her, I was able to select the pieces, discuss which was the perfect piece for the show. Actually, this is a selection of a larger show. The show in total is like 75 pieces or so. So there is another piece by her in the original idea of the show. So it was, we had to negotiate all of that, what is better, why not, like with Carlos Ruiz Tanaka and the crabs. I went to his studio and I selected a piece and we discussed this idea of the crab, and in between both of us made the decision of what was the best piece for the exhibition. The image of the Ravana could be appearing in many ways, masks, the wood carves, but while doing the research for this particular work, and I went back and forth with his gallery because the artist was very old, so we communicated through the gallery. In our discussions, we talk about specifically the wooden, the piece, the carvings of this particular rendition of the Ravana and the dialogue with them. Not all. Yeah, not all. So this exhibition was not meant for our museum. So that was a challenge. It was bigger than our museum. So we had to edit the exhibition as well, and it was very difficult. There are two great pieces that I love, and it's one that you also love, the Tomio Take circle of the creation of the World Series, and a piece by the Argentine Brazilian artist that it's a collage. It is a really fantastic piece. That those are two, and that's an untitled piece. That those are two of my favorite pieces that are not in the show. But you pick my favorite one, the Kazuo Wakabayashi at the entrance. Yeah. Yeah, it was, I had to make executive decisions because I couldn't show everything that I wanted to show or trace all the migration I wanted to trace. So for example, the Korean migration to Argentina is not there, or the Filipino migration to Argentina as well is not there. And those were really important. But this was a show that was born from the Art Museum of the Americas permanent collection. And we tried to use those migratory patterns, the ones that we found in our collection. So that helped me to just not go crazy. I need to include everything, and it was very difficult, but yet I had to stop at some point. I couldn't have like a really big show, and instead of 6 years, it had taken me like 10 to put the exhibition together. Yeah. So 15 years ago, I began as an intern. That was at the Art Museum of the Americas, and today I'm the director. So that's pretty awesome. And my very first job was to work with our archives. We have a collection of archives of Latin American, Caribbean art dating from the 20th century, from the beginning of the 20th century. And I started to see all the files on all the Japanese Brazilian artists. And that's something that I always had in my mind. And then as I got closer to the collection, I saw those pieces and I was totally in love. And when I became the curator, one of my very first projects was an exhibition titled Fusion Asian Migration to Latin America and the Caribbean through the Art Museum of the Americas permanent collection. I was like the first version of this exhibition, but smaller. And was fascinating And what was even more fascinating was to know that the Organization of American States was one of the very first institutions that highlighted these migrations and the works that these artists were doing in the 50s and 70s and 60s. And I had to spread that information out. People have to know about that. And then I was very, from Latin America, I'm Colombian, and I was like very disappointed in the fact that nobody told me at school, and my undergrad is in history, about these migrations. It's information that is not out there. And yet there are some institutions in the United States that are promoting these migrations and organizing exhibitions. It is not in the radar of all the scholars. And we usually tend to think about Latin American art as a dialogue between modern and contemporary Latin American art, as a dialogue between Europe and the United States. And it's way beyond that. Thank you.